To understand its impact, we've assembled an international panel. Here in our studio, Isaac Cohen is the former director for the United Nations Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean. From Nairobi, David Owiro is an economic and public policy analyst. And from New York, Nicholas Economides is professor of economics at New York University. And from Beijing, Peter Ho is a professorial research fellow at the London School of Economics. I want to welcome all of you to the broadcast. David, why don't I begin with you? In the past, Africa attracted aid from the West, but now it's attracting investment from China. Stake out the differences, if you will.
Well, thank you. There are two major differences in the new approach that China has taken regarding Africa's development needs. The first is that the aid that traditionally came to Africa was conditional aid, mostly from the IMF and the World Bank, and they had conditionalities around governance and so forth, governance and human rights. Whereas for China, this has been based on a mutual respect, mutual agreement around brothers. And so this aid that has come from China has largely been based on the priorities of African countries. And so largely the aid has been around the African Union's commitments and priorities around Africa's Agenda 2063, and it has come to core issues around infrastructure and technological support, and also to support natural resource extraction across the continent.
David, as a follow-up, I had a friend who used to live in Kinshasa back when the DRC was known as Zaire, but he told me stories about how aid would come to the port. He'd see government officials going in their cars, throwing stuff in the trunk, then the military, on and on. But he said the aid never really got to the people. And he's, and I talked to another friend from Nairobi just a couple of years ago who said, the difference with China is you build roads, you build railway. All of a sudden, people can actually get their stuff to the market quickly. And they viewed it as the old aid was a crutch. This is actually more a partnership. Is that how you would see it as well?
It certainly is, because as you've mentioned, the aid that comes from China is mostly towards supporting infrastructure developments like roads and building railways and so forth. Whereas traditionally we had aid generally coming in to address crisis. So if we had a food crisis or famine or drought, then people would see Western support or international support for that matter. And so this is certainly a different kind of aid. And it indeed is being, the perceptions, at least at the leadership level, is that this is an equal partnership that Africa has with China. And that China really does care about priorities of African countries and therefore invests its support for key priorities of African nations.
Peter, we've been talking about its footprint in Africa, but we know with the Belt and Road Initiative, it extends beyond that, Asia and now into the Americas. Talk to me about some of the concerns, though, because we are hearing them. The U.S. Vice President back in October called it debt diplomacy. About the same time, Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State, telling Latin American nations, you need to have your eyes wide open in dealing with China. How is that being viewed there in China, and how would you respond to these criticisms?
Well, of course, there are a lot of concerns in the West about the Belt and Road Initiative. And what you can see is that the initial euphoria that was in the West about China's rise has sort of turned into much more worries. What will China mean for the world? Will it be aggressively pushing its own interests for the Belt and Road Initiative, so on and so forth? And my sense actually is that much of the feelings are also driven by the fact that people don't know very much about China. And also the idea that the rise of China, which of course is a form of globalization, that globalization only comes in negative forms and that it is a zero-sum game. But that is of course not correct, because globalization has negative effects, of course, but it also has a lot of positive effects. And I think you have to see both sides, and see both sides also in terms of the Belt and Road Initiative. And in that sense, you actually will see that the infrastructural development can have also quite a lot of positive economic effects for certain countries. But there are issues in terms of what sectors can be opened up for Chinese investments and what not. And I think countries themselves will make that decision what kind of sectors they regard as their own strategic sectors where they are more wary about foreign investments. And that's actually not just about China, but I think that counts for any country that receives foreign investments.
Yeah, good point. Isaac, let me ask you about the region, because it's interesting. You have this Pence-Pompeo 1-2 punch saying, hey, watch out. And yet the U.S. administration doesn't really seem to have a policy for its neighbors to the south. And when it talks about its neighbors to the south, we hear more about the migrant caravan. They're going to come up here. They're going to invade our country. They're going to take all our jobs. If you're in the region, what kind of message are you getting from the U.S. versus China?
Well, in the region in Latin America, the United States is still the main investor and probably the main trading partner for most of the countries of the region. Some countries have developed a relationship with China, where China has become now their main trading partner. This is the case of Chile, Brazil, and consequently, the presence of China has been tied to the access to raw materials that these countries produce, basically metals, agricultural products. And in the case of Latin America, China has not been granting aid. It's basically lending. And lending, of course, it has to be in productive activities, and basically it has been related to trying to build an infrastructure related to the products that China is interested in. And I think that's the way it should go: roads, ports, that kind of thing. Now, the problem is that Latin America has had, in its economic history, a problem with debt. In the 80s, it was a lost decade for Latin America trying to meet their debts. Mm-hmm. And consequently, Latin American governments today are very, very aware of the risks of going beyond certain limits as far as debts are concerned. And in the case of China, you can see some difficulties already, for instance, related to Venezuela, where you have an economy that is in trouble, and some of these loans have been tied to supplies of oil, and these supplies are very difficult to meet at this point. So there is an experience about that, and I think that up to now, things are going well. But I think the Latin American governments are going to be very cautious about assuming higher levels of debt.
But the interesting thing is the United States doesn't seem to have that engagement with the region as much as they did in the past. In fact, in some respects, some of Trump's steps, with the tariffs and the punitive tariffs, we're now seeing even more soybeans from Brazil going to China. Talk to me about that. There's the lack of engagement on the U.S. side.
Absolutely. Trade, investment from the United States has been mainly from private sector. It used to be banks in the days of the petrodollar circulating in the region. Now it's private foreign investment. But in the case of trade, you have several countries that have free trade agreements with the United States, besides the new U.S., Mexico, Canada agreement. There is, of course, Central America, Colombia, Chile, Peru. Those countries have free trade agreements with the U.S. So that's part of the setup there. In the case of the renegotiation of the North American Free Trade Agreement, the old NAFTA, I think that progress has been accomplished in the sense that NAFTA is still there. I mean, the expectation that this was going to be disappearing or changed in a way that was not convenient for the member countries, I think that has been toned down a little bit. So up to now, protectionism from the part of the Trump administration, which is one of the main pillars of its economic policy, has affected Latin America already, but less so than other regions.